I fell in love twice for the first time in 1998. First with Cindy Swinderman, who was my girlfriend at Walt Disney World. And Cindy was amazing and continues to be, but she brought me to the other place that I fell in love with, which was Puerto Rico. I had never been to the island. I had never been off of the mainland. And this 21-year-old kid gets down to Ponce in Puerto Rico and sees this island for the very first time and fell in love. And I have had a love affair with that island for almost 3 decades now. Puerto Rico has always been a place that I have loved. Anyone who knows me knows that I have said that for years I'll die on the island, hopefully of my own choosing. But it's always been a special place to me. The culture, the food, the history. And I've never been able to really properly address that here on this podcast because I was always looking for the ideal book, the ideal guest, the ideal circumstances to talk about Puerto Rico history, and where Puerto Rico is today in the American stratosphere. And thankfully, we just got through talking to Ed Morales. Ed is the author of Latinx, The Latin Beat, and Living in Spanglish. His work has appeared in the New York Times, The Village Voice, The Nation, and Rolling Stone, among others. He's also a lecturer at Columbia University, and he's the author of a book that is now in its second printing called Fantasy Island, Colonialism, Exploitation, and the Betrayal of Puerto Rico. I read this book this week, and it is fascinating. It is at times incredibly frustrating to see that what goes on this island, but it reveals so much about Puerto Rico, Puerto Ricans, the United States, colonialism, empire, banking, world politics. It is a fascinating read. And I just got through recording the pod with Ed just a few moments ago, and I'm so thankful to him for coming in and talking to me about his work and the island. This was a really, really enlightening conversation with maybe the best book I've read this year. I've been searching to say what my favorite book was this entire year, and I kind of think that this might be it. So I hope you're ready. Sit back and relax because our conversation with Ed Morales is next on Reckoning with Jason Herbert. My name is Jason Herbert. I'm a Southerner who lives in the West. I'm a historian, an outdoorsman, and a movie buff. I like finding new answers to old questions, and this is a reckoning.
That's reassuring.
Yeah. Well, so I was just telling you before we started recording how excited I was to talk about this book in your work. And then I tore into your book in the preceding days. And, oftentimes whenever I'm trying to do pods, I always read through the books and so forth. But sometimes they're more of a cursory thing. Hey, what's the author trying to get at here? What are the kind of questions I can ask and stuff like that? And I opened up your book and I literally could not put it down. I was getting text messages a couple of days ago, like, how you doing? Are you done? I was like, no, I'm 8 hours in at this point in time. Just reading is hard. And just, I felt at times, Ed, when I was reading like I was back in graduate school, I was making so many notes in my notebook reading through here. And I'm so excited to talk to you about this island, your work in general. So thanks for coming in today.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. I mean, it's a little dense, but I really wanted to make that kind of argument, probably because I did 2 years in grad school in economics, and I never really explored that in my journalistic work.
I'm an environmental historian by trade. And so when I jumped into the book, I'm thinking I'm going to read culture, I'm going to read society. And of course, that's in here and politics. And this is, like you're saying, there's a hefty bit of economics here. And I'm getting this crash course in American colonial economic policy in the Caribbean, which was absolutely fascinating to me to see how all of these things are playing out, especially in the near term, in the recent decades. before we jump into Puerto Rico, before we jump into your book, do you want to introduce yourself to our audience and kind of go from there?
Sure. My name is Ed Morales. I've been really more of an alternative journalist since the sort of the end of the 80s. I was a staff writer at the Village Voice, but after that, I did get some more mainstream media opportunities. And most of my work is focused on Latinos in the United States, but also Latin America. But because when I started, there weren't that many people covering those things, that I was able to do both hard news stories and feature stories about the arts, which suits my personality a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So that really helped. And then about 15 years ago, I started adjuncting at the Columbia University Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race. And that amplified the academic aspect of my work as well. So I've written 4 books, and I have about 35 years in journalism.
We've had a bunch of folks from Columbia on this podcast. I like to pride myself and tell myself that I'm holding up the university at this end. Jelani Cobb was just on, I think, last week. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was great. He was terrific. But we've had a few folks in, and then you wrote this book. This now it's up for its second printings. Fantasy Island: Colonialism, Exploitation, and the Betrayal of Puerto Rico. I love this thing so much. Can you talk a little bit about why you felt compelled to write this initially, and then maybe kind of come back and revisit that now here in 2025?
In my journalistic work, I hadn't really been able to focus that much on Puerto Rico because, frankly, there wasn't a lot of demand among editors for stories about Puerto Rico. And at the same time as well, like in the 2000s, 2010s, my parents retired and they moved to Puerto Rico. I'm originally from New York. I grew up in New York. And I was visiting a lot more. So when I really felt like I had much more of a pulse of what was going on there. And a lot of Puerto Ricans who live in the States who haven't migrated recently, have spent most of their lives, have difficulty reconnecting. So it was a big thing for me to reconnect. And then when I had been doing some stories for The Nation about various things. In 2010, I wrote a story about the consent decree that was put on the Puerto Rico Police Department because of these abuses that occurred during demonstrations by the police department. And then I covered some more political things for The Nation, including the run-up to the debt crisis. And then when the hurricane hit, I had been pitching this book, right, about Puerto Rico for a while. But when the hurricane hit, there was suddenly a lot of interest in the book. So it was, it was a terrible event. My mother got caught up in it, but it helped to gestate the opportunity for the book.
Ed, you're from New York. We'll talk a little bit later on about this. Let's talk about the expression New Yorican the other day. A friend of mine had never heard this expression, and there are all these beautiful expressions in your book. I remember the very first time I was referred to as a Ibero when I was in Ponce.
Really, they called you Ibero? Good for you.
My girlfriend did. My novia did.
That's nice.
Well, I'm from Kentucky originally, so she's like, "Oh, you're a Ibero." I was like, "What does that mean?" She's like, "You're one of us. You're fine." But I guess one of my frustrations, you kind of alluded to this just a few moments ago, is like people weren't interested in talking about Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
I've been going back and forth to the island since 1998. I have loved this place, and I'm just this poor kid from Kentucky who went and was like, "What is this place?" Right? But I've also always found I'm like people are reticent to talk about the island. Maybe sometimes more in favor of more exotic places when we talk about, these other more popular places when we talk about the Caribbean. In Florida, we talk about Cuba a lot, obviously. But it's it seems to be like Puerto Rico doesn't get the attention it deserves, unless like someone's complaining about Bad Bunny being at the Super Bowl, right? Like, what's with that? Is there a reasoning? Do you see the reason why Puerto Rico doesn't get the attention maybe that some of these other spaces get?
Right. First of all, I want to elaborate on your mentioning the term Nuyorican because that's who I am, and
yes, sir.
It kind of refers to people who have roots in Puerto Rico but grew up in New York and sort of fuse the cultures and go back and forth between the languages and don't give up the original culture. And it's actually the subject of the book that I'm writing now, which hopefully we'll be able to talk about later. But I'm sorry, I forgot your question. I'm sorry.
Why doesn't Puerto Rico get the attention?
Mm-hmm. Well, look, I think that a lot of it is because the unclarity, the lack of clarity about the status, which was, if you read the book, it was sort of purposely done because it's kind of an awkward situation for the U.S. because in reality, Puerto Rico is a colony and it doesn't fit well into the American what am I trying to say? Origin story, the heroic American origin story of having liberated itself from colonialism from Europe in the 18th century. So, there's an ambivalence about the fact, I guess, that all Puerto Ricans are American citizens, and there's an unspokenness about how the island is kind of like this property of the U.S. Like the insular cases say that Puerto Rico belongs to, but is not a part of the U.S. So it makes for sort of an awkward engagement with when you go to Mexico, when you go to in Asia, foreign countries, there's a clear understanding that this is a foreign country and people have different citizenship and it's an exotic place. And I think people don't know what to make of Puerto Rico. Especially because of the citizenship and maybe the way Puerto Ricans are uniquely aware of, what's going on in the United States. I don't know if people realize that, the cable broadcasting system, now we have the internet, but for many years, they showed like WGN and, my dad used to watch Cub games all the time, even though we're from New York, but so there's an awareness in Puerto Rico of everything about American culture, but at the same time, there's this barrier. So it's kind of awkward to talk about, I think.
Yeah, there's this real dissonance that takes place here. I'd long thought about Puerto Rico as a colony, but I hadn't thought, and it hadn't really hit me until I'm reading your book when you say, wait, this is the oldest colony in the world. It's still a colony, and it's really never had its own national independence. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, first we have to recognize that Spain was the main colonial owner of the U.S. and it was one of the first colonies because it resulted from the earliest of Christopher Columbus or Colon's journeys, so that's about 400. It's 1490. It was really about 400 years between that and the 1898 war with Spain. Which Cubans will tell you that that war should be called the Cuban War of Independence, and the U.S. just sort of came in later because Cuba had been trying to get its independence from Spain for a while. There wasn't as much organized opposition to the Spanish colony in Puerto Rico. In fact, in 1898, Spain offered Puerto Rico this new status, which would allow it to have 2 or 3, I forget the exact number, representatives in the Spanish parliament and Spanish citizenship. And a lot of people in Puerto Rico were in favor of that. But in Cuba, like everybody, most people really wanted independence, except for some of the elite landowners who still felt loyalty to Spain. Does that answer your question? I'm sorry, I think I got off to.
No, absolutely, right.
Yeah.
And there's this fascinating thing, 1898, and I tell you, I'm reading your book, and I'm looking over my right shoulder at the shelf over there for Theodore Roosevelt, and I'm kind of shirking
Same.
Ed, going, "Oh Jesus, what am I doing?" I work for the Forest Service during my when we're not in furlough, so I'm like, "Yeah, Theodore Roosevelt's great on this," and then I think about his imperialistic policies and go, "No, actually." But you look at 1898, and there's all of this stuff that goes on between Cuba, Puerto Rico, Philippines, Hawaii in those years. And Cuba is allowed, I'm going to put that in air quotes, its own independence by the United States, but that doesn't happen for Puerto Rico.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about maybe why, you talk about this in the book, but why does the United States not just say, hey, okay, Puerto Rico, congratulations, you're your own people now. We've done our thing for democracy, instead of establishing our own colony in the Caribbean?
Yeah, it's related to what I was just speaking about, which was that there were a lot of organized rebellions against Spain in the latter part of the 19th century. And a lot of those militias were actually Afro-Cuban militias. So it relates to this story about race in Cuba as well. So the United States did not want to deal with the potential of renewed resistance because there were still organized militias in Cuba. And they felt like they could still control the island's economy just as well, because for most of the 19th century, a lot of the Cuban elite was already sort of interwoven with the American elite. They would send the top elite would send their children to Ivy League schools and go back and establish businesses there. And also they had this thing called the Platt Amendment, which a lot of people don't know about, which is this act of Congress that stated that the U.S. could interfere or, land invade in Cuba if there was something that, it was wrong, that wasn't beneficial to the U.S. And I think that got revoked, I think, in the 30s at one point. But so that was their sort of assurance. They already had this sort of hegemonic control over the economy in Cuba. And Puerto Rico, because it had a less developed economy, was more of a place where it would be good to have some military outposts, and the economy wasn't very developed. So as I explain in the book, they set it up so a lot of U.S. agricultural interests could control most of the agricultural industry in Puerto Rico.
When I teach high school and college, I would always say, just look at the plantation owners. That's where the bad stuff is happening. It's never good. All the way to say now in my home in Florida, where we see the sugar plantation south of the Lake Okeechobee in the Everglades. But so Puerto Rico becomes a colony of the United States. That's passive tense here, but citizenship doesn't immediately get extended to Puerto Ricans for a little while. And then when it does, it doesn't come with the full benefits of, say, people born in New York or Florida or Kentucky or Colorado. It's this mixed bag.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about, say, why the United States decides to extend citizenship in 1917? And then also what's different, because the governance of Puerto Rico and, say, the ability to vote in elections and things like that is radically different than, say, in Fort Lauderdale.
Yeah, well, what happened was that there started to be these legal cases of people who wanted to migrate from Puerto Rico to the United States for one reason or another. There had been people migrating to the United States from Puerto Rico even when it was a Spanish colony. So sometimes they had family here and they wanted to come, or they just wanted to come for entrepreneurial reasons. And they ran into a problem because Puerto Ricans were technically stateless. It was not, they didn't have sovereignty. So there was a problem. There was an immigration problem in terms of they didn't know how to deal with, people who wanted to migrate. And they decided that the best solution to it would be to make everyone a citizen, because it would get past, it would get past these problems with commerce and free flow of people. The second question that you had was So the thing about 1917, the reason it happened in 1917, that's actually kind of like a hotly debated topic among Puerto Rican historians. Like as a sort of a rhetorical way of looking at it, a lot of nationalists say that it was because it was the tail end of World War I, and they needed to have a bunch of citizens that they could draft into the military. And in fact, my grandfather served in the military during World War I. Was segregated, so he was sent to I think it was Guyana or Panama or something. And but there are some people who say that there are some historians who say that that's not true, that it was really more about trying to resolve this dispute over citizenship. Now, you're saying about what's different about the elections in Puerto Rico?
Well, yeah.
Or the political system in general?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah. So I guess maybe a one-on-one for people who aren't familiar with the way that Puerto Rico is governed, as far as who runs the show in Puerto Rico and how does it represented in Congress and so forth. Like, how are Puerto Rico's interests represented on the mainland, I guess?
Right. Well, one of the things they did was give Puerto Rico they gave Puerto Rico this sort of nominal representation in Congress by allowing for this office called the resident commissioner, and the resident commissioner, has been there since this time. It's a new person. They're elected every 4 years, and what they do is they go to all the committees. They participate in the House committee discussions. They can even make suggestions, but they don't have a vote. And this is true as well for other territories like Guam and U.S. Virgin Islands, right? In fact, there's someone from U.S. Virgin Islands who has been arguing a lot about the problem with this lack of representation. This woman, I think it was the governor of Virgin Islands. I forgot what her name was. But so there's no, it's wrong to say that Puerto Rico has no representation in Congress, has no voting representation in Congress. Puerto Ricans cannot vote for federal office. They can't vote for president. But the trade-off is that they don't have, they're not levied with federal income taxes, but they do pay taxes to the municipal government. Now, the weird thing is, it has in 1952, when they established the Commonwealth, which I talk about in the book, they wrote a new constitution, which was based in part on the UN Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. But they always had, executive branch and legislative branch. But the thing is that the parties, unlike, most of the political parties in most of the world, are usually somewhere along the lines of liberal versus conservative, no matter what the parties are called. But in Puerto Rico, the parties are based on what status you are in favor of. And there are three options. One is the current status, which is, it's called Commonwealth, but it's a euphemism for being a colony. There are benefits to it. There's American citizenship. There is limited federal entitlement. There's not as much, there's a cap. Like, for instance, for things like SNAP, now SNAP is in the news. Mm-hmm. There's a cap on the amount of money. In the U.S., it's entitlement, for every citizen, and there's no cap, right? I mean, now they're just not even giving the money out. But so the Commonwealth status, that's one. And then there's statehood, people who aspire to statehood. And, there have been many plebiscites over the years in which Puerto Ricans have expressed their preference on what status they want. And then there's independence. But the thing is, independence is usually has been historically a small constituency. But as I lay out in the book, and many, I'm not the only person to say this, the idea of independence has been, largely repressed in the island since the 1930s, when there was a big nationalist movement. In 1950, there was this insurrection. We just recently went past the anniversary date of that. And so the FBI really did a lot of surveillance on people in Puerto Rico. They passed a law that was sort of inspired by one of the McCarthy laws during McCarthyism, which is called the gag law, which did not allow people to openly express their support for independence. Now, a lot of people say that it outlawed the display of the Puerto Rican flag, but that's technically not correct. It's not in the law, but it was interpreted that displaying the Puerto Rican flag could be a way of expressing desire for independence. So the independence option has, it was never really a minority, because there were always, since the U.S. took over Puerto Rico, there were always people who preferred the Commonwealth status or the statehood status. Recently, the number of people who want to vote for independence or have expressed a pro-independence position has increased markedly. So that's one change that's happened. But again, now there's you can say that the statehood and the Commonwealth positions are roughly analogous to liberal and conservative. I mean, with the statehood being conservative and Commonwealth being liberal. But the problem is that within the statehood party, there are people who are registered Democrats. So it's there's this sort of liberal position of statehood as well. So it's not fair to say that they really represent conservative versus liberal, although in more recent years, the statehood party has been strongly in line with Trumpism.
It's interesting you talk about how statehood, people favoring statehood have been in line with Trumpism. When I see recently people like Mike Johnson talking about, if we make Puerto Rico a state or blah blah blah, I get tired, Ed, of hearing Puerto Rico used as a slur when it comes to this idea of statehood, because I've heard it multiple times over the years. I don't think I get a say in whether or not Puerto Rico should be a state or independent. I'm of the opinion of whatever Puerto Rico wants to do is great with me, because I'm not Puerto Rican, right? I don't have ties to the place other than an affection for it, right? But I wonder, when I hear people talk like Mike Johnson recently saying, they just want to make Puerto Rico a state so they can vote this way or the other. What I hear is anti-Latinx. I hear anti-Catholicism. I hear anti-Brown, anti-Spanish speaking. Am I wrong? Am I wrong here in when I hear this rhetoric here in the mainland?
Yeah, I mean, sure. You've identified, a tendency in the Republican Party not favoring statehood. I think I wrote about in the book that it's a little bit like the Reagan welfare queen slurring. Puerto Rico is, if it were a state, it would be by far the poorest state in the Union. There's a lot of people who depend on, government programs, federal assistance. And so, but it would, not only that, it would be, since the entitlements are capped, right? If it were a state, then there would no longer be a cap. And so right there would be a pretty significant increase in federal outlays. And then the Puerto Rico tax base is perceived as being very poor. It would be, as if all of the poor neighborhoods in the United States, like the South Bronx or, South Side of Chicago, were colonies, which some people say they are. In the 60s, they said they were. And then there was a move to incorporate the South Bronx or the South Side of Chicago. And people would say, but, we'd have to give out all this money in federal entitlement. And then, the income is so low that we wouldn't get any, tax money to balance that out. So that their argument is an economic argument. But, these things always reflect race. I mean, it's much like, if you look at Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case for Reparations, and he talks about redlining, the people were out there, protesting. There are these pictures of, white middle-class people in Chicago in 1959 protesting against, the end of redlining or black people moving into their neighborhoods. And they said, we don't have a problem with black people. Black people per se, we don't have anything against black people. It's just that the property values of our neighborhood would go down. That's our argument. So it's very similar to me. It's the Republicans will say, this is not a race argument. This is really about economics. But the problem is that the economic reality for people, and this is whether or not you subscribe to the idea that there is systemic racism, and this is very controversial now in the Trump era. But it's intricately tied to race, people's economic realities.
Yeah, which is strange because I don't see anywhere in the founding documents about whether or not statehood being tied to economics. Because, geez, would we even have Mississippi right now? I think one of the frustrating things for me is when I think about this island, and I've been a few times now. I've had the pleasure of being able to go and experience it a little bit. I think about the beauty of this space. And if you haven't been to Puerto Rico, my God, you talk about Luquillo. And I was there in 22. And I was
so
like,
glad.
I love it. I have turtles. I love turtles, man. So, seeing this place, seeing the Condado, seeing Ponce, seeing Rincon, right? These spaces are, El Junque, right, are otherworldly in their beauty. And then I also can't help but see the troubles with infrastructure, poverty, things like that, right? And you talk about people use this argument towards, it's an impoverished place, the economics of it. And when I read this book, I go, but the United States created these conditions here. And I guess maybe that's the thing I really want to talk to you about, because this is a hard book at times. It's not a comfortable read at times when I read about both the conditions created by mainland United States policies, and then also, as you point to, some of the corruption on the island itself, how these factors intertwine to create this fantasy island. Can we talk a little bit about how American policy in Puerto Rico kind of created this space that they claim to not like?
Well, to be fair, it was a colony before the U.S., and the Spanish also created a lot of conditions of exploitation. There was slavery. Slavery did not end in Puerto Rico until 7 or 8 years after it did in the United States. There's still a problem with racism in Puerto Rico. So when the U.S. came in, the little control that the island's elite had, the people who owned the sugar plantations and other agricultural businesses, they were sort of cut out of the process. And the tax laws were rewritten, and a lot of property laws were rewritten to make it easier for U.S. to acquire more of these lands and force people out because of these new tax policies. And also, it was a relatively diverse economy. A lot of people in Puerto Rico are very proud of the coffee. The coffee was a major export. In Europe, people bought Puerto Rican coffee. Even in Cuba, people bought Puerto Rican coffee. To a lesser extent in the U.S., so it was a more diverse economy with a lot of different agricultural products. And the U.S. tendency was to consolidate it into a kind of a monocrop system where, sugar was, the main thing to be exploited. And so that and also, the elite that controlled the island's finances and economy, are not heroes in the situation, but the cutting out of the opportunity for people on the island to feel like they could develop agricultural businesses, it sort of stunted, the potential for economic growth, and also the profit was not being reinvested in the island. I went to a seminar about 7 or 8 years ago where this economics professor said that, and it's in the book, that the GNP to GDP ratio in Puerto Rico is one of the most severe in the world in terms of the amount of wealth that's created not staying in the island. Most countries are somewhere between 80 and 95% of the profit stays in the country, but in Puerto Rico it's more like 70%. So it's made it sort of, it's handicapped the island's ability to create a self-sustaining economy that's not just about creating profit for external investors.
What about this idea of maybe the drain of Puerto Ricans from the island? Can we talk a little bit about, say, Operation Bootstrap, and then kind of maybe talk about Puerto Ricans on the mainland as well? Because there's these ties back and forth. You talk so strongly. As I'm reading the introduction to this book, I just feel this coming through you, this idea of this homeland here. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, it relates to what I was talking about before. You know, there was this figure, Pedro Albizu Campos, who is still revered as this national figure of liberation. He's the one who, drove the independence movement, which was, tied to this party called the Nationalist Party. From the 30s, he really actually was very involved in the strikes at the sugar plantations, trying to organize workers. And so because of they jailed him, but there's still all of this protest activity. And then there was this insurrection where the National Guard was actually brought in and bombed this town called Jayuya in the middle of the island, right? So because of all this tumult, and because of the fact that in the post-war era, the UN and the international pressure was wanting to accelerate the process of decolonization. So Europe gave up most of its colonies in Africa and Asia, and so the U.S., which really set up the UN, was feeling like, especially under Roosevelt, FDR was pretty progressive, decided that this is not looking good, and we should at least create this idea that it's not a colony. And so they developed this Commonwealth status. There was a new constitution. They allowed Puerto Ricans to elect their own governors, which wasn't true until that time. All of the governors up until 1948 were usually appointed military governors from the United States. So when they did all that, they also said, and there was this guy in Roosevelt's cabinet, and I'm sorry I forgot his name, but he was very progressive. He was into land reform, and he had this vision actually that that wasn't fulfilled. I mean, he wanted a more radical land reform and more control for Puerto Ricans. He was the last governor, the last U.S. appointed governor. And I'm sorry that I forgot his name. I'm looking around for a book that would tell me. But so when that happened, they said, okay, so we want to develop this semblance of an industrial economy in Puerto Rico, with some, light industry factories and things like that. And they wanted to develop suburban tract housing because that's what was happening in the United States. And this happened around the late 1940s and early 1950s. And they said, well, because we're transitioning away from this subsistence agricultural economies that were still existing despite, the stranglehold that the U.S. agricultural corporations had, there's going to be more people who are landless and they're not going to have jobs, and they're just going to wind up in cities and, increase the look of a poverty factor. And so they encouraged U.S. business owners to receive Puerto Ricans, and there was this mass migration that happened, and that's like when my parents came. They came in the late 40s and early 50s, and there were all these jobs in New York. There was, to a lesser extent, Philadelphia and Cleveland. Some people actually went as far as Hawaii, although that process started in the when the first takeover in the end of the 19th century. So that created a sizable population of Puerto Ricans in New York, and it coincided with all of these social changes that were going on in the United States. And unfortunately, one of the reasons for the stereotyping of Puerto Ricans was because there was all of this. There was this tendency in the U.S. after World War II, to look at what was wrong with what was happening in the U.S. What were the social problems in the U.S. And there are a lot of films actually that talked about this. The movie about alcoholism. I forget what it was called. There was a movie about alcoholism. They had movies. They had Frank Sinatra's movie about the heroin addict, and they had all of these movies about juvenile delinquents. And so, since Puerto Ricans who were coming up at the time were caught up in the gang era, it was one of the things that really stereotyped Puerto Ricans, unfortunately created. And the West Side Story is the classic example of that. So it created this community in the U.S. And right now there are more Puerto Ricans that are living in the U.S. than there are on the island, and it's becoming even more so because of the considerable economic problems and the healthcare crisis and the electrical grid crisis that's in Puerto Rico. And there's a kind of like a new diaspora now of people who are pretty much millennials. And that's a whole other identity. And they also have been growing up in the Midwest, in Atlanta, South Florida. So that's a whole other thing.
I want to ask you then, as a man who grew up in New York with ties back to Puerto Rico, is there a sense in Puerto Rican communities, say in New York, elsewhere, maybe in the mainland, of Latinidad, or of community with, say, Cuban Americans or Dominican, or are there pretty hard lines drawn between nationalities on the mainland?
Well, yeah, I mean, there are always differences. I mean, there are different, even when some communities are closer, there's still differences. Like, for instance, Dominican Republic has had a lot of migration, and the situation between Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic is very similar. A similar kind of people speak the same kind of Spanish accented wise, but there are rivalries. And then there's always a difference between Puerto Ricans and other Latinos because of the fact that we have citizenship, and we never really go through a migratory process. So there's some people see that as entitlement. Some other groups feel that Puerto Ricans are entitled because they never have to go through this. They don't have family members who are here and undocumented, things like that. There are really different. There's a lot of cultural differences between people from the Caribbean and people from Mexico and Central America and South America. There's differences between Puerto Rico and Cuba because Puerto Ricans who came here were usually the poorer class or darker skin class. And the Cubans that came from after the revolution were more the lighter skinned middle class professionals who were not in favor of state control over the economy that Castro imposed. So there's like a lot of class differences between the Cuban diaspora and the Puerto Rican diaspora. The class thing between Puerto Ricans and Dominicans is similar, but we have that interruption because of the fact that Puerto Ricans have citizenship. And then again, as I said, Mexican and Central American culture is much more influenced by indigenous culture. The Caribbean, because of disease and other factors, the indigenous populations were almost completely wiped out by the middle of the 18th century. So, there's no existing tribes of indigenous people in the Caribbean. And it's more of, if there's a mixture, there's more of an influence from Africanness.
We talk a little bit about the emigration from Puerto Rico into, say, New York, other places and things like that. I told you my first trip to Puerto Rico was in 1998. My first love was a girl named Cindy Slinderman, who was from Ponce, but her dad was a white guy whose parents had moved down in the 50s. I think Jim, her father, had moved. He was 3 when they arrived on the island, and he spoke better Spanish than he spoke English. And his English was heavily accented, although he looked just like me, right? And I know that was part of that economic transfer in the middle of the century. But when I read your book now, I pick up on a real anxiety about non-Puerto Ricans, whites especially, wealthy especially, the Jake Pauls, not the Jason Herberts, moving down onto the island and gobbling up these spaces. Is this a real fear about losing maybe the Puerto Ricanness of the Puerto Rican, of the island? Like what's at stake here?
I think the analogy is gentrification of Latino or Black neighborhoods in the United States. I'm sure you've seen how some Blacks and Latinos have objected to the gentrification of their longtime neighborhoods like Harlem, East Harlem, or even South Central East LA.
Sure.
So it's a similar thing. It's when outsiders move in, the sense of community is disrupted. The Bad Bunny has this song about comparing the fate of Puerto Rico to Hawaii, and so that's sort of become very popular because and I actually went to Hawaii last year. If you go to Hawaii, you don't see like a lot of markers of the indigenous culture, in a lot of the tourist areas. And it was never really that pronounced in Puerto Rico, but a lot of the reason for that is that it's it's already like a mixed European, indigenous, African culture. So
right.
That's in some senses that's why the culture of Puerto Rico is so present there, because it's not at all like just Black and indigenous. I mean, it's a mixture between the Spaniards and mostly Black culture. So the thing is that the real estate speculation that's happened in the U.S. The model, the Airbnb model, Old San Juan. Have you been there, right?
Oh yeah, many times.
So Old San Juan is is this beautiful colonial city. It's very much like Havana or Cartagena, Colombia. If you ever get a chance to go there, it's almost the same thing, except that it's smaller than both of those. It's a beautiful colonial city, and I always felt really attracted to it. Going back to the 70s and 80s, a lot of it was really run down. Actually, like the Lower East Side was in New York. And over the years, some people came in and, actually Puerto Ricans came in and renovated some stuff. And, it's a beautiful place. But when people saw that a lot of the property was being bought up by speculators and people from the United States, it made them uncomfortable. And then there's a lot of controversy over the beach thing, because there's this law that goes back to the Spanish colonial times that gives all citizens access to beaches all around the island. And so developers come in and try to wall things off and say, no, you can't go to the beach. And then there's these big demonstrations, and they've been actually quite contentious. So Puerto Ricans feel that the intense the real estate speculation, which is also pricing them out of a lot of places that they might want to live, they might not only be displaced from their neighborhoods, but the culture itself, the integrity of the culture is threatened by this.
The big thing that it feels to me the threat to this island right now is this crippling debt that is happening right now. Can we talk a little bit about this? I don't think many people who don't have an eye towards Puerto Rico have an understanding of how bad this debt situation is. And I don't see an answer here, Ed, to it other than just complete forgiveness. But I mean, I don't know here. Can we talk a little bit about this debt situation? A 101 situation for people who are listening in.
Sure. Obviously, the idea of forgiveness is something that should be on the table. In fact, as I think I wrote in the book, when Bernie Sanders is running for president, he, proposed this idea where the U.S. would itself buy up most of the debt, and then renegotiate it with the debt holders, and then use some money to invest in Puerto Rico to work towards a self-sustaining economy. And I'd always felt like that was, the best solution. And, unfortunately, all that stuff sort of coincided, the Bernie Sanders being phased out by the Hillary Clinton taking over the nomination. All of this happened at the same time that they devised this Promesa bill. Maybe we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. I'll briefly talk about it. I'm sorry, I should have started this way, but
Please.
the practice of debt accumulation, basically to cover basic government expenses, really began in the 1970s. Because Puerto Rico was reacting to the recession in the United States and the OPEC crisis, which people say in Puerto Rico, if the U.S. has a cold, Puerto Rico has a fever or something like that's much worse, right? And so it started then, but it really accelerated after 1996 because there was this law in place that allowed U.S. interests to come in and set up businesses and get very little tax on them, right? So this law was ended by Clinton because Bill Clinton was sort of in this back and forth with Republicans who wanted to cut expenses, in the 90s. This was sort of like the beginning of that whole Republican era of moving towards a balanced budget and really cutting back government, which is now in full swing. So it was called Section 936 of the Internal Revenue Tax Code. So when that happened, a lot of business industries, pulled out of Puerto Rico, and negative growth started to set in. Now, the weird thing about that is that the statehood party wanted that because, they deny it, but the rumor was that they wanted Clinton to end it because they thought that Puerto Rico would be in such a bad situation that they would have no choice but to accept Puerto Rico as a state to revitalize it. But of course, that didn't happen, right? And so that plus the explosion of the municipal bond market, which really wasn't that big until the 80s and 90s, really, and the fact that Puerto Rico has a triple tax exemption on its bonds, and if you're a bond investor, you know this, right? It's like, most bonds that you buy, municipal bonds, there will be taxes on it, but Puerto Rico will not have state, local, or municipal taxes on the bonds. So they became extremely desirable. And then it became such a hot market that it was sort of over-speculated on. And then to bail it out, Wall Street used these complex financial instruments to shift the debt to later. I think I talked about it in the book, like it's sort of like an adjustable rate mortgage where you're going to buy a house and then when you take out the mortgage, you have these relatively low mortgage payments, and then in like 2 or 3 years they explode, right? So that's what happened in Puerto Rico. But every time the debt service exploded, then they made this new deal with Wall Street, to defer more of the money. And basically, it's just it got really. It's as if you have a credit card and they tell you, okay, it's only going to be 4% interest, and then 2 years later it's like 25 or 30, and it's exploded. So, and the fact that since Puerto Rico does not have a self-sustaining economy that creates wealth that is kept on the island, it created an impossible situation, basically. $72 billion plus $45 billion in debt obligation and pension obligations. Now, the thing about the Fiscal Oversight and Management Board, which is created by Promesa, which is something that happened in 2016 under the Obama administration, that was their compromise. They said, no, we're not. Obama did not want to seem as if he was going to do a bailout, of Puerto Rico, which is what, that's what Bernie Sanders now. Of course, recently Trump is being criticized because of giving $22 billion to Argentina, which is not even part of the United States, just because he likes the president, right? So, so when that didn't happen, then, the Promesa came in, and actually Promesa has reduced the debt by, I think, about 25 or $30 billion, which might sound really good to people. But, the fact is that most economists don't think that it's repayable, and that there will be a return to bankruptcy proceedings, in a matter of years. Like, I've talked a lot with Alfred Stiglitz and Martin Guzman, who are at Columbia, and who are actually part of this international movement to try to forgive a lot of debt in the global South all over the world, because countries in the global South are not able to invest in infrastructure, climate change stuff, disease control, because of this enormous debt. So they told me that they thought, and they've published, it's not that they just told me, but they published that it wouldn't really be reasonable to expect a recovery from Puerto Rico unless the debt was cut by 90% or more than 90%.
Yeah, it feels to me that if the debt were forgiven, Ed, doesn't that make Puerto Rico able to sustain itself if it's not having to make these outrageous payments and so forth? And now we're talking about infrastructure redevelopment and economic revitalization and environmental protection and stuff like that. If you're not having to I can't see the United States as being if we can throw this money to Argentina, certainly the mainland could absolve the debt. Does the United States have the capacity, I wonder, to just wipe the slate clean if it wanted to?
I think that when you look at some of the spending practices that's going on now, it would appear that they would. I think a major factor should, include not giving the wealthiest, corporations and business owners such a large tax break. I mean, a lot of revenue could be raised from just a tax policy that resembled something that we had, immediately after World War II or even the 60s. So yes, I do think that it's possible, and then there are people who believe in this modern monetary theory. I forget her name, but she wrote this really good book about this, where the economist that I'm referring to, and I'm sorry I forgot her name, she says that the U.S. has the power to print money as long as the dollar is the dominant currency in the world. It can print as much money as it wants, to do these things, because the money just gets reinvested, and then that grows the economy. I think that's the real disconnect that's going on right now. It's this idea of what really creates wealth, and the rhetoric about the balanced budget really only serves the wealthiest interests, from having to give some of their money out for taxes and not, just concentrate it. They have created this rhetoric, that says that jobs won't be created or wealth won't be created if they're taxed. And the opposite is probably true. I mean, it just seems logical that the ability for people to be consumers, the market seems to be depending on consumers to buy goods. If people don't have money to buy goods, then how is the economy going to grow and expand? So, sometimes I tell people, when I grew up, Rockefeller is the wealthiest person in the United States, and they were paying like 75% income tax, and nobody thought that they were poor or struggling. I mean, they had some of the most magnificent real estate properties around the world. So it's hard to figure out why this logic has taken hold. But, one thing is that, there's a lot of economic speculation that the U.S. dollar is in danger of losing its position as the most dominant currency in the world. And that may be something that's holding this idea of modern monetary theory back. Sorry to go so deep on that, but
no,
it seems
I
like
wanted
common
to
sense
know.
to me. Yeah.
It does, right? You and I both woke up and there's a trillionaire in the world, which is mind blowing to me. I want to ask you, we've been talking about the past of Puerto Rico. I just read your book. You and I have been talking about the last 400 years of Puerto Rico. How do we move forward for the island, for the people themselves? What do you think's necessary? I wrestle, Ed, with the idea of the idea that the colonial system can stay in place indefinitely. I hate this system, but I'm not Puerto Rican. So how do we? What's the way to go here?
Well, I wrote this chapter recently in this book that's supposed to come out on Haymarket Press. I was in a fellowship with the Center for Puerto Rican Studies and also a professor who's based in Princeton, Yorimar Bonilla. So I wrote this chapter about the idea of reparations for Puerto Rico. And, it's just, it's hard to, from the Trump rhetoric point of view, it's hard to see this, from like maybe from more of the perspective of someone like Mamdani. I mean, maybe not. But the idea of, there are some economists in Puerto Rico who have estimated the economic harm has been caused by the U.S. historically in the United States, and dollar figures to represent that. The dollar figures can be argued over, and it's very controversial, but some sort of either lump sum or payments over 20 years, and sort of a policy directive to allow Puerto Rico to help develop a self-sustaining economy. My proposal is about independence. That's what I would favor. It seems difficult within, the current state of politics in the United States to ask for something like that. But it's there are various reparation movements going around, either African Americans in the U.S. or Caribbean nations have also floated these reparations proposals. For me, that would be the best way forward. Now, that sounds like maybe a little bit of a radical departure from politics the way it is now. This would have to this idea about reparations would have to be something that is directed by government or experts that have been assigned to the task. And I'm not talking about individual reparations the way it's been talked about in the African American community, and that has to do with the fact that as I write about in the book, it's not all the fault of the United States. I mean, there's many people in Puerto Rico who have collaborated with the United States, who are part of the political and economic elite, that have really made off, very well from the current situation. So it's hard for me to say, well, every Puerto Rican should receive, $1 million over 20 years as reparations, because a lot of those people are people who in Puerto Rico who have, made quite a bit of money by collaborating with the United States and engaging in the same kind of exploitative activity. So, for me, now, if you weren't going to be that radical, what's being proposed now by political forces in Puerto Rico is this idea of constitutional convention, of a status convention, where politicians and civil society and economic experts can get together and discuss seriously what would happen under various status. There's a economist called Jose Carballo Cueto who has done these studies about what the economic outlook would look like under all three of the status proposals. So, I mean, I think a serious discussion certainly is in order, and something that, Congress should initiate, because, as I say in the book, Congress still, the reason why we're a colony is that Congress retains plenary power over the United States. There was one thing that I talk about in the book that I'm really not sure how valid it is, but one of the ex-governors of Puerto Rico, Anibal Acevedo Vila, talked about this idea that in the last instance, if Puerto Rico defaulted on its debt, the debtors would then go to the United States government to recover the debt, because if Puerto Rico is a possession of the United States, I mean, that's usually the way it works, if you are related to someone who has debts, and the person dies, they usually go for you, right? So, in a sense, the U.S. is ultimately responsible for the debt because of the political status, and the whole Promesa thing was created, because there was no sovereign status. Argentina is still in court, still haggling over these loans to the IMF, and it's not clear. And look, they wound up getting a bailout from the United States. So, I do think the U.S. bears the ultimate responsibility, and it's a little bit of a fiction, to say that, well, because of irresponsible behavior, this, and that about what Puerto Rico has done, and therefore Puerto Rico is in debt and has to repay this debt. I mean, it's a little bit defying logic.
Yeah, I think that it's too much for us to get into this entire conversation, but that's the reason why you wrote this amazing book that lays out how this economic system was put into place and what the ramifications for that are. And that's what, I guess when I talk about the island and when I talk about people, it doesn't come up in every single conversation, Ed, but when I talk about Puerto Rico, what I want for people to do is to care about this place because it matters. It's this amazing space. I have to ask you though, you alluded to this a little bit earlier. You've got another project you're working on based on this Puerto Rican diaspora in New York. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I can't say that much about it because I want, people to be excited about, when they read it.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I mean, basically I've been working on this theoretical model for a while. It was inspired by this, actually, ironically enough, a Cuban-American filmmaker who was really anti-Castro, but I still became friends with him because he really loved Nuyorican, and he actually made 2 films about famous Nuyorican. He made the film about Hector Lavoe that starred Mark Anthony, and then he made a film about Miguel Piñero, who was a Nuyorican poet. And what happened was I was assigned to cover the Puerto Rico Film Festival in the 90s by the Village Voice, and I would go every year. And so there was this American Airlines strike. I think it was in 1993. And Leon Ichazo was the name of the filmmaker, and I were stuck in the Puerto Rico airport all day because there was a strike and we couldn't get out on a flight. So we talked, and he said he wanted to make a movie about someone from the salsa world and someone from the poetry world, and he wanted to make a movie about the Young Lords, the political group. So he wound up making those 2 movies about salsa and poetry, but he never made the movie about the Young Lords. And so in my courses that I teach at Columbia, I talk about these 3 spheres in the Nuyorican experience, and that define the idea of what Nuyorican is. And one is, salsa music. And salsa music kind of looks towards the past because it's nostalgic and it's trying to reconnect Nuyorican to the island. And the politics at the time dealt with the present because the Young Lords were involved with all of this new left stuff that was going on, and radical rebellion against the U.S. government from the late 60s and early 70s. And then the third one, the poetry looked toward the future because the bilingual expression was this sort of modern thing or postmodern thing that eventually really influenced by rap and hip hop. In fact, I was a performing poet at the Nuyorican Poets Cafe in the 90s, in the second edition of it. And we had this thing at this club called the Fez in downtown Manhattan, which was rap meets hip hop. And so we would have these poets read, and then we'd have these young rappers come, and it was kind of the predecessor to this show on HBO that was called Def Jam Poetry, right?
Oh, yeah.
So in the book, what I try to do is I try to take these figures from all three of those worlds, and I show how they're all sort of interconnected. A lot of these people knew each other. Ray Barretto would do concerts for Puerto Rican independence, or when Angela Davis got out of jail, there was a big celebration in Madison Square Garden in 1974. Pedro Pietri came to fame really because he recited his poem, The Puerto Rican Obituary, in the first Young Lords Takeover in 1969. So I talk about sort of their personal stories and how the era evolved, and sort of the excitement about being young and Puerto Rican and having the world at your feet, but sort of being bilingual and being proud of your original culture, but really conversant in U.S. culture. A lot of these people they're looking at the avant-garde. They're looking at all of the stuff that was going on, and it wasn't like this contained ethnic thing. They were really involved in everything. So that's really what the book is about, and it's been a really exciting process. Some of it has been tinged with poignant moments. Like a lot of people who I've interviewed, some have already passed away. Some people I was trying to interview, they passed away. A lot of, Eddie Palmieri died recently. And I feel like I've been living in the 1970s for like the last 2 years, so it's a little odd. But I'm very excited. I'm not done yet, but I'm getting close to being done.
I'm listening to you tell me about this project, and all I want to do is talk to you. And we're gonna have to wait for another pod to do this, because now I want to talk about Puerto Rico through the arts, through pop culture, the issues of identity and belonging, and all of these other stories that I'm just dying to ask you. But I'm going to save that one for the next time I ask you to come on, because Ed, I'm so grateful to you for your time today and this book, which was so enlightening. I can't tell you how much I just sat here in this chair I'm sitting in right now for hours on end this week, just pouring through this thing, which I just loved. I really want to thank you for taking the time to be here on this pod. This was, for me, absolutely enlightening. It was I finally got a chance to sit and talk about this place that I have such an affection for. So thank you so very much for coming in and talking on this pod today.
Oh, thank you. And I'm so glad that you connect to the island, and it's not unusual. I had a friend a long time ago who said that her grandmother married someone who came from Eastern Europe and joined the army in 1898, and then was part of the invasion, and he left the army and fell in love with someone in the countryside in Puerto Rico, and that was like her grandfather.
Well, I'll tell you, anyone who knows, and I felt bad now. I'll tell you this now, but like anyone who knows me knows that I say this for years. To saying, "I'll die in Rincon." Like that's
a place to go.
Well, if you like to surf, if you like to surf and you like to fish, that's a good place to be. So, but listen, the first time I got down there and had arroz y condules, I was done. So, this little kid from Kentucky was like, "What is this place?" So, and have been for 30 years now. So, anyway, thank you so much for taking the time. This was amazing.
Sure, thank you, Jason.
Of course. And that's a wrap here at Reckoning with Jason Herbert. Thank you so very much to our guest, Ed Morales. Ed, I was terrified to try to speak Spanish to you in this because I would butcher it, but thank you so much. Next time I'm going to do this en español. Pero for now, thank you so very much for coming in. Thank you to our producer, Fletcher Powell, for making this show operate. And thank you to all of you for continuing to listen and be advocates for Reckoning with Jason Herbert. If you like the show, if you like what we're doing, you can Like and subscribe on Apple, on Spotify, wherever you listen to your stuff. You can find our Substack on jasonherbert.substack.com or just find me at herberthistory.com. But thank you so much for continuing to share and send the good messages of support. And if you get the opportunity, go visit Puerto Rico. Go see this place. Go eat the food, talk to the people, and see it for yourself. It is a special, special place, and I think you will be really happy that you did. But until then, we'll talk to you a little bit later. Ciao for now. Bye.